The walk to grandmother's house. Jimmy Washington was a spirited 13-year-old who loved spending his afternoons at his grandmother's house in the Oakwood neighborhood. Her home was a sanctuary, filled with the sweet aroma of freshly baked cookies and the warmth of unconditional love. It was his haven, a place where the world's noise quieted, replaced by her cheerful humming and soft-spoken wisdom. On a bright autumn afternoon, Jimmy carried a small gift, a silk scarf he had saved up to buy for his grandmother. He loved surprising her with little tokens of affection, each one bringing a bright smile to her weathered yet radiant face. As he strolled through the neighborhood, Jimmy didn't notice at first the two police officers, Officer Grant and Officer Baker, walking a short distance behind him. The Oakwood neighborhood was typically calm, a tapestry of old brick homes and towering oak trees. The police presence was a rarity, and on this day, unsettling. The unfolding encounter. Jimmy glanced back once, then again, realizing the officers weren't merely passing by. Their eyes were fixed on him. His heart began to race, a tight knot of unease forming in his chest. He adjusted his grip on the small box in his hands, his father's words ringing in his ears. "If you ever feel unsafe, call me right away." Though hesitant, Jimmy slipped his phone from his pocket and dialed his father, Chief Andrew Washington, the newly appointed chief of police in their town. His father answered almost immediately, his deep, reassuring voice steadying Jimmy's nerves. "Dad," Jimmy whispered, keeping his eyes on the officers. "There are two cops following me. I think something's wrong." "Where are you?" his father asked, his voice sharp with concern. Jimmy described his location, and Chief Washington responded firmly, "Stay where you are. I'll be there soon." Before Jimmy could reply, the officers quickened their pace. One called out, "Hey, kid, stop right there." The command wasn't friendly. It was authoritative, almost accusatory. Jimmy turned, his small frame straightening as he clutched the box tighter. "Yes, sir," he replied, his voice wavering. Officer Grant, the older of the two, squinted at him. "Where do you think you're going?" "To my grandmother's house," Jimmy answered truthfully, pointing down the street. "It's just a block away." The officers exchanged glances. Their demeanor was cold, their questions relentless. "What's in your pockets?" Officer Grant demanded, his tone leaving no room for protest. Jimmy hesitated, his grip tightening on the box. "Just a scarf I bought for my grandma," he said. "Empty your pockets," the officer ordered, stepping closer. Jimmy felt his cheeks flush with both fear and indignation but complied. The officers inspected his belongings, finding nothing suspicious, yet their expressions didn't soften. The chief arrives. Back at the precinct, Chief Washington's heart sank as he hung up the phone. He knew all too well the weight of assumptions and prejudice, having spent his career working to bridge the divide between law enforcement and the communities they served. But hearing his son's fearful voice brought those struggles to his doorstep in a way he hadn't anticipated. Without wasting a second, he grabbed his car keys and sped toward Oakwood. As he turned onto the street, he spotted two officers standing over his son. Jimmy's small figure seemed to shrink under their imposing presence. Chief Washington's grip on the steering wheel tightened. Pulling up to the curb, he stepped out of the car, his commanding presence drawing immediate attention. Dressed in casual clothes, he didn't look like the town's top-ranking officer, but his authority was undeniable. Chief Washington." "Sir," Officer Grant stammered, recognizing him. "What's going on here?" Chief Washington asked, his tone calm but carrying a steely edge. His eyes shifted between his son and the officers, taking in the tense scene. Officer Grant faltered. "Sir, we thought he was suspicious. He didn't look like he belonged around here." Chief Washington's gaze hardened. "Suspicious," he repeated, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm. "You thought my son was suspicious." A lesson in respect. The weight of the moment hung heavy in the air. Officer Baker, younger and clearly uncomfortable, shifted his weight from foot to foot. "Sir, we didn't know," he mumbled. "You didn't know," Chief Washington interrupted, his voice growing firmer. "You didn't ask. You assumed." He gestured toward Jimmy, who stood quietly, his box still clutched in his hands. "Does this young boy look like a threat to you?" Neither officer could meet his gaze. "This is my neighborhood," Chief Washington continued. "My son is walking to his grandmother's house, just as he's done countless times. Yet, instead of protecting him, you harass him. Is this how you serve this community?" Officer Grant cleared his throat, attempting to regain his composure. "Sir, we were just trying to ensure." "To ensure what?" Chief Washington interrupted, his voice rising. "That a 13-year-old boy carrying a scarf for his grandmother is treated like a criminal. This is not how we do our job. Our badge represents trust and respect, not intimidation." The officers stood in silence, the gravity of their actions settling over them. Chief Washington turned to his son, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Jimmy, are you okay?" he asked softly. Jimmy nodded, his eyes glistening with relief. Turning back to the officers, the chief's voice was firm but resolute. "This is a lesson for both of you. Every person you encounter deserves respect. Every decision you make carries consequences, not just for you, but for the people you're sworn to protect. If you cannot uphold these principles, you have no place in this force." Moving forward, as Chief Washington led Jimmy back to the car, the two officers remained rooted in place, their faces pale with shame. The chief's words reverberated in their minds, planting seeds of reflection that would grow in the days to come. For Jimmy, the experience was sobering, but his father's swift action and unwavering support left an indelible mark. That day he learned the power of standing firm in the face of adversity and the importance of integrity, lessons that would guide him for the rest of his life. And for the community, the incident became a turning point. Chief Washington used the experience to initiate meaningful reforms, emphasizing empathy, training, and accountability within the force. Slowly but surely, bridges were built, and trust began to blossom. Jimmy never forgot that autumn afternoon, or the scarf that eventually made it to his grandmother. It became more than a gift. It was a symbol of resilience, love, and the enduring fight for justice. The father's arrival. The sun cast long shadows over the Oakwood neighborhood as Chief Andrew Washington parked his car at the corner of the street. He stepped out with purpose, his broad shoulders squared, and his face set with a mixture of concern and resolve. To the untrained eye, he looked like any other parent coming to check on their child, but his mere presence commanded respect. As he approached, Jimmy's heart leaped with relief. His father's calm demeanor and steady stride filled him with a sense of safety he hadn't felt moments before. The two officers, however, were caught off guard. Officer Grant's posture stiffened, and Officer Baker seemed to shrink slightly under the chief's intense gaze. Chief Washington's voice broke the tension, low and deliberate. "Would one of you like to explain what's happening here?" The question wasn't shouted, but it landed with the weight of a gavel. Officer Grant, the senior of the two, hesitated before stammering. "Sir, we thought the young man looked suspicious." Suspicious. The word hung in the air like a storm cloud. Chief Washington's eyes flicked to his son, standing small but brave, clutching a box in his hands. His gaze then returned to the officers, who were visibly uneasy. "Yes, sir," Officer Grant continued, his confidence faltering. "He was walking alone, and well, this area has seen some unusual activity. And you assumed he was part of that unusual activity," the chief said evenly, his tone deceptively calm. "Tell me, Officer Grant, what about my son? This 13-year-old boy walking to his grandmother's house looked like a criminal to you." Officer Grant opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. He shifted awkwardly, clearly flustered. Officer Baker, the younger and less experienced of the two, looked down at the pavement, his cheeks flushed with embarrassment. Chief Washington didn't wait for an answer. "Let me make something very clear. You are wearing a badge that represents trust and justice. That badge does not give you the right to harass a child simply because he doesn't look like he belongs. Did you ask him where he was going? Did you ask him if he needed help? The officers exchanged guilty glances, neither daring to speak. A confrontation of values. Instead, the chief continued, his voice rising slightly. You decided to intimidate him. You decided to search him without cause, without respect, and without regard for who he is. That is not policing. That is profiling. Officer Baker finally mustered the courage to speak. Chief, we didn't know he was your son. Chief Washington's sharp gaze turned to the younger officer. And if he wasn't my son, if he was just another boy walking down the street, would your actions have been any more justified? The weight of the chief's words sank into Officer Baker, who nodded slowly, his expression heavy with regret. Officer Grant, however, seemed to bristle under the scrutiny. With all due respect, sir, Grant began, his tone defensive, we were just doing our job. It's our duty to protect this neighborhood. Chief Washington's jaw tightened. Your duty is to protect everyone in this community, Officer Grant, not to target them based on assumptions. This neighborhood isn't yours to judge or control. It belongs to the people who live here. That includes my son and his grandmother. The chief stepped closer, his imposing presence forcing both officers to stand straighter. Respect is not optional in this line of work. It is the foundation of everything we do. Without it, we lose the trust of the very people we're supposed to serve. Lessons in accountability. As the conversation continued, a few neighbors peeked out from behind curtains, curious about the scene unfolding on their quiet street. For some, the sight of the chief holding his officers accountable was a powerful reminder that change could happen, even in small, everyday moments. Chief Washington turned to Jimmy and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Son, are you okay? He asked, his voice softening. Jimmy nodded, his grip on the box relaxing. I'm okay now, Dad, he said, his voice steady but still tinged with emotion. The chief looked back at the officers. I want you both to listen carefully, he said. Today could have been a very different story. This could have escalated into something far worse, for my son, for you, and for this community. But we are going to make it a turning point instead. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. You're both going to meet with me at the precinct tomorrow. We'll review your actions today and talk about what needs to change. And you're going to participate in community outreach programs to learn what it means to truly serve and protect. Officer Grant's face was a mix of resistance and resignation, but Officer Baker nodded earnestly. Yes, sir, he said quietly. I understand. I hope you do, Chief Washington replied. Because if I see behavior like this again, you won't just be answering to me. You'll be answering to this entire community. The path to healing. As the officers stepped away, clearly humbled, Chief Washington walked Jimmy back to the car. The boy looked up at his father, his admiration evident. Thanks, Dad, he said quietly. Chief Washington smiled, his stern expression softening. You don't need to thank me, Jimmy. It's my job to protect you, just like it's their job to protect everyone. But we're going to make sure they understand what that really means. The drive to Jimmy's grandmother's house was filled with quiet reflection. When they arrived, her face lit up with joy, unaware of the events that had transpired. Jimmy handed her the box, watching her eyes brighten as she pulled out the delicate scarf. It's beautiful, Jimmy, she said, pulling him into a warm embrace. Just like you. A ripple effect. The next day, Chief Washington followed through on his promise. At the precinct, he led a candid discussion with Officer Grant and Officer Baker, emphasizing the importance of empathy, awareness, and accountability. He also introduced new training protocols, aimed at breaking down biases and building stronger relationships with the community. In the weeks that followed, the Oakwood neighborhood began to notice small but significant changes. Officers started engaging more positively with residents, attending local events, and even volunteering at the community center. Trust, long fractured, began to mend. For Jimmy, The experience became a defining moment. He saw firsthand how his father turned an injustice into an opportunity for growth, teaching him that courage and integrity could spark meaningful change. And for the officers, it was a lesson they would never forget, a reminder that every action, no matter how small, could leave a lasting impact on the lives of others. The ripple becomes a wave. Weeks turned into months, and the events of that autumn day didn't just fade into memory. They became a catalyst for transformation, both in the Washington household and the community of Oakwood. Chief Andrew Washington understood that systemic change required more than stern lectures and temporary reforms. The police force he now led had long operated on outdated assumptions, and his role wasn't just to manage it, it was to rebuild it. Jimmy's experience was a painful reminder of the work ahead, but it also provided an opportunity for progress. One of his first steps was to implement a program he called Bridge the Badge, designed to foster genuine connections between officers and the communities they served. Every officer, from rookies to veterans, was required to participate in workshops, forums, and community events. The program didn't just focus on policing tactics, it emphasized listening, understanding, and compassion. Jimmy's growing voice. Meanwhile, Jimmy was finding his own way to process what had happened. Though his father had handled the situation with poise, Jimmy couldn't shake the lingering questions. Why had those officers seen him as suspicious? Why did it take his father's authority to make them stop? At first, Jimmy kept these thoughts to himself, but a conversation with his grandmother changed that. "You know, Jimmy," she said one evening as they sat on her porch, sipping lemonade. "Sometimes, when people don't understand something, they fear it. But fear doesn't have to win. You can teach them to see things differently." Her words struck a chord. Jimmy realized he wanted to be part of the change his father was working toward. With his dad's encouragement, he joined the Bridge the Badge program, offering a unique perspective as a young member of the community. His story became a powerful tool in training sessions, helping officers see the world through the eyes of the people they served. Jimmy also took to his school's student council, proposing initiatives to educate his peers about their rights and responsibilities when interacting with law enforcement. His passion inspired others, and soon, his classmates were joining him in organizing events and discussions aimed at fostering mutual respect. The officer's journey. For Officers Grant and Baker, the aftermath of their encounter with Jimmy was humbling. The mandatory sessions with Chief Washington were eye-opening, forcing them to confront biases they hadn't even realized they held. Officer Grant, in particular, struggled to reconcile his actions with the values he thought he stood for. One session involved sitting down with residents of Oakwood and listening, truly listening, to their stories. The experience was uncomfortable but transformative. Grant heard from parents who feared for their children, elders who felt invisible, and teens like Jimmy who just wanted to be seen for who they were. Officer Baker, the younger of the two, embraced the changes wholeheartedly. He began volunteering at the Oakwood Community Center, tutoring kids in math and helping organize sports tournaments. Slowly but surely, he started building genuine relationships with the people he once saw only from behind a badge. One day, while organizing a basketball game, Baker was approached by Jimmy. "Hey, Officer Baker," Jimmy said, holding out a basketball. "Wanna play a game? One-on-one?" Baker hesitated, unsure if the boy was serious, but Jimmy's grin was infectious. "Sure," he said, taking the ball. The game was lighthearted, filled with laughter and playful banter. For Baker, it was a reminder of why he had joined the force in the first place, to make a positive impact. A community transformed. The changes weren't limited to the police force. Oakwood itself began to evolve. The Bridge the Badge program brought officers and residents together in ways that hadn't happened before. Neighborhood barbecues, town halls, and cleanup events became regular occurrences, creating a sense of unity that had long been missing. Chief Washington also worked with local schools to implement education programs focused on civic engagement and community building. Jimmy's school became a pilot location, and he was proud to be part of the initiative. The program taught kids not just about their rights, but also about their responsibilities as members of the community. One evening, during a town hall meeting, a resident named Mrs. Parker stood up. She was known for her fiery spirit and unfiltered opinions, often critical of law enforcement. But this time, her tone was different. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 30 years, she said, her voice steady but emotional. "And for the first time, I feel like we're being heard. I see officers walking these streets not to patrol but to connect. And I see people, young and old, stepping up to do their part. This is what community looks like." Her words were met with applause, a standing ovation that marked a turning point for Oakwood. Jimmy's legacy. By the time Jimmy turned 14, the impact of that day had blossomed into something far greater than he could have imagined. He had grown into a confident young leader, unafraid to speak his mind and work for change. His relationship with his father deepened as they collaborated on ways to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the community. One evening, as they sat in the living room reviewing notes for an upcoming Bridge the Badge event, Jimmy turned to his dad. "Do you think we'll ever live in a world where people don't make assumptions like they did that day?" he asked. Chief Washington looked at his son thoughtfully. "I think it's possible," he said. "But it takes people like you, people who are willing to stand up, speak out, and keep pushing for what's right." Jimmy smiled, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he also knew he wasn't walking it alone. The power of one moment. The events of that autumn day became a story that Oakwood shared for generations. It was a reminder of how one moment, one decision, could ripple outward and transform an entire community. Jimmy's courage, his father's leadership, and the willingness of the officers to learn and grow showed that change wasn't just possible, it was inevitable when people worked together. For Jimmy, the lesson was clear. No matter how small you feel, your voice matters. And for Oakwood, the lesson was even clearer. Unity begins when we see each other not as strangers, but as neighbors. A closing chapter of hope. As the seasons changed and the years passed, the story of that autumn afternoon remained etched in the hearts of everyone in Oakwood. It wasn't just a story of a boy and two officers. It was a testament to how communities can grow and heal through understanding, courage, and accountability. Jimmy Washington, once a scared 13-year-old boy, grew into a confident young leader who used his experience to inspire change. His voice became a beacon for others, proving that even the smallest acts of bravery could have a profound impact. He often spoke at schools, community centers, and even police academies, reminding people of the power of empathy and respect. Chief Andrew Washington continued his mission of reforming the police force. Under his leadership, the department became a model for community policing, one where trust and respect replaced fear and suspicion. Officers like Grant and Baker became symbols of redemption, showing that even those who make mistakes can learn, grow, and contribute to positive change. The Oakwood neighborhood transformed into a shining example of unity. The lines that once divided officers and residents blurred, replaced by shared experiences, mutual understanding, and a collective commitment to creating a safe and welcoming community for everyone. The lesson for you all. The story of Jimmy and his father reminds us that moments of adversity can serve as turning points. It teaches us that empathy is essential. We must strive to understand the experiences of others. Everyone has a story, and taking the time to listen can break down barriers and build bridges. Courage comes in many forms. Whether it's a 13-year-old boy standing firm in the face of fear or a leader holding others accountable, courage is the catalyst for change. Growth is always possible. Mistakes are inevitable, but they don't define us. What matters is how we respond. Whether we choose to learn, grow, and make amends. Change begins with us. Each of us has the power to create a ripple effect. By treating others with kindness and respect, we can inspire others to do the same. A legacy of hope. As Jimmy's grandmother often said, It's not the challenges we face that define us, but how we choose to overcome them. Her words became a mantra for Jimmy, his father, and the entire Oakwood community. In the end, the events of that day were more than a painful encounter. They were a spark that ignited a movement. And as Oakwood continued to grow and thrive, it stood as a reminder that when we choose understanding over judgment and unity over division, we can create a world where everyone belongs. The story closes with Jimmy, now older, walking once again to his grandmother's house on a warm autumn afternoon. The streets are filled with laughter, and he passes an officer he now knows by name. They exchange smiles and a friendly wave, a simple gesture that says more than words ever could. The lesson is clear. Change is possible when we stand together, one step at a time.